In this tutorial, we're going to modify our code a little bit and take out the section that deals with where the ship is and the movement of the ship from the game and actually place that into a new class. And the reason for this, I mean, everything is working as is, but as we grow our program and as we create larger and larger games, we're going to need to be able to differentiate the different chunks of code, and object-oriented programming is a great way to do that. We'd like to define a class, and a class is going to hold all of the variables and the methods or the functions that that class can do. So it's a logical representation of an entity within our program. Now the best way to do this is to come here in our Star Shooter project, and let's actually add a new class, a new file. Okay, we're going to select General here. So I'm going to, if you didn't follow what I did there, I'm going to right click on the Star Shooter project, and then I'm going to click Add, and then I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be an empty class file, and I'd like to call this thing the ship. So I'll call it capital S ship, and I'll hit enter there, and what's going to happen is a new ship.cs file is going to be created, and here is the code that it comes with. It's going to be a class, and here's the name of it, and we have an empty constructor. Now the first thing we're going to want to do is place any code that we want to have happen when I create a new ship inside of this constructor. Now constructor is a special method which has the same name as the class itself. So public class ship, I'm creating a new class called ship, and then ship is going to be this function or this method that has the same name, and that's going to be the constructor. So anytime I create a new ship object or a new instance of the ship class, it's going to run whatever code is in here in this constructor. Okay, before I actually place any code in there, I'd like to actually take care of the using. We're going to have to deal with all of the PlayStation, sce.playstation.core, and all the graphics and the input and so forth. We're going to move all of the drawing and all of the input handling from our main program into the ship class. And so in order to make use of that, I'm going to come here to my app main, and I'm going to take all of these using statements, and I'm going to copy them into my ship because I'm going to want to make use of these as well. Okay, so just copy and paste the using statements from your app main into the ship class, and that's going to give us access to all the drawing and the input handling that the PlayStation mobile development gives us. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is take the logic for drawing the ship and handling all of the input out of the main program and into this new ship class itself. Now one thing I'd like to point out is that we have a variable called ship, which is of type sprite, and I'm going to change that a little bit now because I want the sprite to be managed within the ship itself. So I'm going to take this sprite information, I'm going to cut that out. Let's get the whole line there, right? I'm going to cut that, and I want to place that into my ship class. It's going to be part of the ship, right? And you need to make sure that you're placing this sprite variable inside of the class, but not within the constructor. So anything that I declare inside of the ship is going to be usable for everything inside this ship. So any variable I declare inside this class, like in this case this sprite, is going to be usable throughout. Now I don't need the keyword static anymore because I've actually got this variable within the class, and I'm going to call this new sprite S instead of ship. So now I've got this variable called S that's going to be usable throughout my entire class, any of the methods that I define here. I'm also going to need to handle a graphics context, and I'm going to call this graphics because you'll notice that in my main application I use this graphics context throughout to draw things, and I'm going to need to do the same thing inside of the ship. Okay, and now instead of maintaining the movement rate and so forth, maybe the ship needs to know how fast it's moving, and so I'll declare that speed variable here inside the ship class itself. So I've got three variables now: a sprite called S, a graphics context called graphics, and an integer called speed that are variables inside the ship. So every ship that I create is going to be able to know this information. Okay, let's go back into our app main, and I'm going to actually load this texture and set up the graphics by taking this information here that we had, and I'm going to move that into the ship class itself. Okay, so I'm not doing any of this setting the color and so forth and the scale. let's go ahead and remove that. That was just us playing around earlier. And I'm going to take this information about the texture and setting the position of the ship. I'm going to cut that now out of the app main and put it in here into the constructor of the ship itself. So now I'm going to set up the texture, and I'm going to set up the graphic, right? I need to rename that S because my sprite is now named S. I'm not calling it S. I'm not calling it ship. I'm calling it S. And so I'm going to say I want the position of this texture to be still centered on the screen, and I want to set up this private sprite that I've got here called S based on this same texture, player ship PNG. Okay, so that all looks good. I've made some minor modifications just because I'm calling that sprite S now, so I had to rename that. And I'd actually also like to set the speed to be equal to 4. Now we had done that earlier here in the update method, but we don't need that speed information in the update method because I'm going to move the ship around within the ship's class itself. So I'm going to set the integer speed here within the class ship, and then I'm going to initialize it to be 4 right here in the constructor. So when I create a new instance of this ship class, it's going to load the texture, it's going to set up the sprite, it's going to position the ship in the middle of the screen, and it's going to set its speed to be 4. Okay? The last thing I need to do is actually take information about the graphics. You'll notice here that the setting up of the sprite requires this graphics information, but I don't have that yet. It's declared, but the ship class doesn't know anything about this. So what I'd like to do is take in a new graphics context as a parameter to my constructor. Now parameters exist inside of this parentheses, and so here's the name of the function, and then anything you want to pass into and have handled by the function needs to get placed inside these parentheses. So the graphics context is the type, and then GC is what I'm going to call it. So this is the variable name here. Okay. Now I want to store this graphics information, and so I want to keep track of my graphics, which I declare here as a variable in the ship class, and whatever you pass into the constructor is what I'm going to hold on to, so that later on I can draw to this graphics. Essentially what we're saying is the ship needs to know the context in which it lives so that it can render itself to the screen. So later on I'm going to put the render code in here, and it's supposed to draw itself, and this texture needs to know how to draw itself. So I need to make sure that I'm passing in this graphics, and I'm going to store that here in the ship. Okay, now that the ship knows how to set itself up inside of its constructor, let's talk about how to render itself. Down here in the render for my main game, what I did was I told the ship to render itself. Now the ship, remember, was a texture or a sprite, and we don't have that anymore. So what I need to do is take this information about how to render this and place it in the logic of the ship itself. So I'm going to create a new method in my ship class. It's going to be public. Now it's going to be public so that people outside of this class can actually see it. You'll notice that we've marked some of these things as private, like the sprite and the graphics context and the speed. And if I mark it private, that means that you can't see it outside of this class. It's usable within the class, like here I'm using this variable S within the ship constructor, and that's fine because the sprite S is declared inside of the ship, but it's marked private, so this variable S is not visible outside of the class itself. Here, if I mark something as public, it's going to be usable, so I can call this method or I can access that variable outside of this class from another space. But here, what I'd like to do is mark this ability to render the graphics to the screen or render the ship. I'd like to make it public so that someone can tell the ship to go draw yourself. And in this case, it's not going to return anything. It's just the job of this function is just simply to draw the screen, draw the ship on the screen. So I don't want anything to be returned, and so I'm going to use this void marker to say, look, this method is public and it's going to do some work for you, but it's not going to give you anything back. So just mark that as void. And I want to create a function called render, and then I'm going to use my open and close curly braces to mark the code that will run whenever you tell me to render this ship. It's actually pretty easy, right? I'm just going to tell the sprite to render itself, and that's all it is. I could put a lot more code here, but all we need to do is tell the sprite that we have here, which is the S variable, to render itself. And that's going to go into the sprite code, And you'll know here, if you go down to the bottom, you have all of this code that's responsible for rendering that sprite. Well, fortunately for us, we didn't have to write any of that. And in order to draw this ship on the screen, I'm just going to tell the sprite to render itself. Easy enough. Okay, there's one more method that I'd like to add here, and it needs to be public as well, and it's not going to return anything to us, but I'd like the ship to be able to update itself. And this is where we're going to actually handle all of that processing of the buttons that are being pressed. So I'm going to tell the ship, hey, look to see if any buttons are being pressed, and if they are, then I want you to move your position, right? So we've got the position of the sprite, and I've got my speed. So the code that we used before here in the update method of the main game, I don't really want to do that here. I don't want the game to be responsible for updating the ship. I'm going to take all of this code that we had, and I'm going to cut it from here, and I'm going to place it inside of the update method of my ship. Right? So we're just going to simply paste that here. Now it's up to the ship to look and see, hey, should I be able to move? And remember, since we're not using the ship's position, right, and the width and so forth, I need to go in and fix all of this because it's not the ship. That's what we used to call it. Now it's called S. Okay, so now I'm going to say, is the sprite's position X minus the speed greater than or equal to 0, and so on down, right? I'm going to look at the buttons being pressed, and I'm going to move the ship locally. I'm going to make sure it updates its position. So now the ship is responsible for moving itself around based on this input. Now the only problem we have is that I'm using this gamepad data, and I don't actually have access to it. You'll notice that I don't have a variable called gamepad data, and the gamepad information is actually being set here in my main program. I need to get access to this. What I'd like to do is be able to say, okay, I want the ship to update itself. So I could say something like ship.update, and I'd like to pass it the gamepad data. I'd like to say, look, I have this gamepad data in the main program, and I'm going to pass that to you and tell the ship to update itself. Now, in order to do that, I need to actually add a parameter here. I have the update function, and it is public, so it's visible. But what I need to do is actually take in this gamepad data. Right? So we'll have gamepad data, and I'll call that gamepad data with a lowercase g here. So here's the data type, gamepad data with a capital G, and then here's the actual parameter's name, gamepad data with a lowercase g. And now I'm actually able to use this. I'm able to ask the gamepad, is the left button down, is the right button down, is the up button down, is the down button down, and so forth, just as I had done before, but now it's all within the logic of the ship. Okay, so this is a lot of setup, and we finally got our ship class defined. We have a constructor that sets up its graphics context and loads in this texture. It creates a new sprite and sets the position and the speed of this sprite. We have our update method that takes in this gamepad data, and it looks to see which buttons are down, and it moves the ship accordingly, and it still keeps it on the screen like we did before. And I've got the render method that allows me to draw this sprite. So really what's public is the constructor, the update, and the render function. So let's go in our app main, and let's actually change this. You'll notice that this is actually quite small now, and what I'd like to do is make use of the ship. So let's create a new private static ship, and I'm going to call it ship. Okay, so now I have a variable called ship, lowercase s, ship, with the type being this ship class, capital S ship. And in my initialize, what I'd like to do is set up the ship to be equal to a new ship, and notice that it's expecting a graphics context, and it's expecting that because in the definition of the constructor, it's asking for a graphics context here. So when I create a new ship, I need to pass it a graphics context. And we've already got that in the previous line. So I'm telling the ship, hey, if you want to draw yourself and you want to manage yourself on the screen, you're going to do so by using the graphics that the main game is using. Okay, we've already actually added the code to tell the ship to update itself. We had kind of stubbed that in earlier. So ship.update, you'll notice that the update function is visible and it's expecting this gamepad data. So I can pass gamepad data to it, and now we'll invoke anytime the game updates itself, the ship should update itself as well. So now the ship is going to be listening in for the buttons. As far as rendering goes, the code that we actually had earlier will still work, because previously I was drawing that sprite and I was telling the sprite to render itself, and now I'm just telling the ship to draw itself. And so it's going to run the render function here that will draw that sprite onto the screen. Okay, so now that we've defined our ship and we have created an object of the ship class right here, we have created a new ship in our initialize. So when the game runs, it's going to run this initialize, it's going to set up our graphics, it's going to set up the ship, and it's going to pass that graphics context into our ship object. Every time the game updates itself, the ship is going to update itself, and we're passing this gamepad data. So in the code of the ship's update function, it's going to listen in on that and move the ship around. And every time we render the game, it's going to tell the ship to render itself. Okay? All of this that we did is not achieving anything new, it's just organizing, and it's making it to where we'll be able to extend this. You should be able to look at the main game code and realize that it's much simpler now. It's going to create a new ship, it's going to update that ship, and it's going to render that ship as the game progresses. So let's run this. And we'll need to make a small adjustment here because you'll notice I had called that sprite ship earlier. Now I need to change that as S. This is a good example of how to do some debugging here, because you'll see anytime you run and it gives you an error, you're going to be able to find those by double-clicking on that, and it will fix that for you. Right? It'll tell you where the error is. So I needed to rename that ship to be S when I copied and pasted that code, and so I missed 2 there. All right, let's run this now. You'll see our errors go away, and we have our game, and we can still move our ship around, and it's still bounded by the extremes of the game itself. You might think, well, okay, nothing's changed here. In fact, a lot has. We now have a ship object, and we could create multiple ships. We could actually create a 2-player game and listen in on different keys for the different ships. We could create 2 of these things. Right? We'll get into how to create multiple objects later, but right now I have a single object, and the main benefit of this segment in the tutorials is now our main game is actually quite clean and small, and all of the logic for moving the ship around and handling and rendering it are nice, neatly placed inside of the ship class. And that'll do it for this tutorial.